All right. What I'd like everyone to do is in the chat pod, if you could indicate your state and then the county of your state where you're connecting from. So I'm connecting from Tompkins County, New York. I'm in Ithaca. And if you go ahead and do that, that'll do two things. It'll help Kristi get a sense of the geographic distribution. Looks like we have lots of New York, Minnesota, Maryland, Florida. Welcome, Florida. Maryland, Wisconsin, I think. Massachusetts, so those are whipping by. Nebraska, West Virginia. Wow, this is quite a geographic spread. That's terrific. So this is good because it helps Kristi understand the geographic distribution that you all are representing, and also it makes you comfortable with, maybe not comfortable with, but at least aware of the location, the use of the chat pod. The chat pod is what you will use when you have questions for Kristi. So feel free, as Kristi's giving the presentation, to use that chat pod and ask her questions. And that's a venue for you all to interact in as well. You okay, Kristi?
I am.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. All right. Last item, we've just broken 12 o'clock, so anybody who's interested in continuing education documentation needs to click on that link. It'll open a online secure web survey tool. You can just leave it open in the background and then jump back, but we're going to move over to the presentation so we can get started. All right, let me introduce myself. I'm Peter Smallish. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I run the webinar series for the Forest Connect program. We've been running now since about May of 2007, so we're having a lot of fun with this, and I'm pleased to introduce today Kristi Sullivan. Kristi's a friend and colleague here in the Department of Natural Resources, and she writes a column each issue of the New York Forest Owner magazine that's called Wild Things in Your Woodlands, and there's been a lot of interest in wildlife related topics amongst webinar participants, so Kristi thought this would be a great thing to do. So Kristi put together this presentation just for you all, and with that I'll turn it over to Kristi, and I'm going to turn my microphone off.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I recognize a lot of people on the list, and there are some that are new to me, so welcome to everyone. If you have any problems hearing me at any time, please send me a little note and let me know, and I'll try to adjust accordingly. So as Pete said, the topic for the presentation today is wild things in your woodlands, and basically what I've done is I've chosen 10 species to just go through and talk about different wildlife species. I've chosen a couple mammals, a couple birds, a couple amphibians, and a couple of reptiles. And not all of them are common. Some of them are. Some are not. I see some people are having a hard time hearing me. Is that any better? Okay, I'm going to continue. I think my mic is up as high as it can go. So you might want to try adjusting the volume via your own computer. I think sometimes that works. Some of these species are common, like I was saying, and some of them are not so common, but I tried to choose species that are fairly widespread and broadly distributed so that they would be species that we all, at least in the Northeast, would have some chance of encountering and interacting with at some point. I wanted to start out with the black bear. The black bear is the second largest mammal in New York State, second only to the moose, which we now have breeding in New York State. Most of our bears are black. Some of them occasionally there's a cinnamon color phase, which is a browner color phase. And the females typically are smaller than the males, weighing about 150 to 250 pounds, with the males weighing about 200 to 600 pounds. And black bears have a very large home range, in excess of 50 acres. So they really need a landscape that's pretty predominantly forest. It can have a mix of habitats that can be beneficial, but really they need at least 50 acres for their particular home range. In New York State, black bears, we have about 7,000 black bears in the state. That's about half of what Pennsylvania has down to our south. We have three distinct kind of high population areas, one in the Adirondacks, one in the Catskills, and then the Allegheny population, which is in the more toward south central or southwestern New York State. Bears primarily breed from June to August, and during that time you may occasionally see males wandering further than they might otherwise, and you may encounter them moving through your property when you might not normally see them. Then bears eat a variety of foods. They're omnivores. They eat things like berries and fruit and nuts, succulent green plants, and even honey. They also feed on small mammals and on amphibians and reptiles, insects, particularly bees and ants, and occasionally fawns. In addition to that, they'll eat garbage and carrion, including roadkill, being a favorite treat of black bears. From August to November, as they try to get ready for hibernation, they spend most of their time actively feeding and might feed up to 20 hours a day, ingesting up to about 20,000 calories per day. Now, when you think about that, I've thought about it some, thinking, it might be really difficult to ingest 20,000 calories in berries and ants and bees and even small mammals each day. That'd be quite a task. And I tried to think of, in human terms, what would be a really high-calorie food that might help us? What could we eat that was really high-calorie to get up to 20,000 calories a day? And I thought of a favorite of mine, which is cheesecake, trying to think of the most high-calorie food that I might enjoy. And I looked up cheesecake from the Cheesecake Factory to find out how many calories were in an entire cheesecake, not just this little slice you see here, but there's about 8,400 calories in one cheesecake. That would be 2.5 cheesecakes a day. And I have to say, I would be in heaven if I could eat 2.5 cheesecakes a day for days on end, getting ready for hibernation. Of course, you'd have to give up eating all winter long, which would be a real drawback. So in order to find high-calorie foods in the fall when bears are trying to gain weight, that's one of the most likely times when we encounter problems with black bears. Black bears in particular coming to our bird feeders. Birdseed, especially sunflowers, are high in fats and are really good food for bears trying to fatten up. So during the fall especially, it's really important to bring your bird feeders in at least at night, and also to avoid having other types of food or attractants out that might bring black bears in and cause conflicts. Black bears den in a variety of areas when they go into hibernation. They may den at the base of a tree, in a large cavity. They may den. I've heard of bears denning in large culverts before, going under driveways or roadways. They may den under piles of debris, woody material in the forest. So many different places that bears might den. Cubs are born in January while the mother is in hibernation. They have 1 to 6 cubs and average about 2 to 3. And when the cubs are born, they're very, very small, similar to puppies when they're born. They can't see. They look kind of like little piglets. But by the time they emerge in the springtime, they're about 10 pounds. They emerge in late March or early April, and they stay then with the mother for a full till 2 years later, basically in the summer, when the adult female is ready to have young again. She kicks the young out, and they're on their own at that point. So by fall of their first year, those cubs will weigh 60 to 100 pounds, and in some cases, the cubs are large enough that they're not really distinguishable from an adult female. Just some ways to enhance habitat for black bears. Some things you can do on your land is to encourage a diversity of mass-producing trees like oaks and beech, and berry-producing shrubs like berries and blackberries. And I see a question by Renee. She asked, was that 1 to 6 cubs or 1 to 6 pounds? And that's 1 to 6 cubs is the range of the number of cubs that a female black bear can have. You can also retain trees with large cavities, and of course that's going to have to be very large trees. Oftentimes we don't have trees large enough to provide a cavity for a black bear, but if you do and you have a really large tree with a nice large cavity, those would be really important to retain for black bear use and for den habitat. You can also leave treetops following a timber harvest or fallen trees that have fallen on their own in unharvested forests to provide cover for den sites. And another important thing to consider when you're thinking about what you can do to enhance an area, enhance habitat for black bears, really is to avoid any activity that would cause conflict with black bears. So, things that would bring them in to feed, the bird feeders, getting in trash, feeding them intentionally, anything that would bring black bears close to humans and cause conflict and really make them more vulnerable to things like being hit by cars or being having to be tracked out as a nuisance animal, anything like that. So just trying your best to reduce conflicts with black bears. Okay, the next species that I wanted to talk about here was the Blackcapped Chickadee. You can hear the call, hopefully you can hear the call of the Blackcapped Chickadee in the background. That's the BB song and then the chickadee call. I read that the call of the chickadee, can sometimes be used for communication, and if there's a predator in the area, there'll be an additional number of DDDs added on as a warning to other birds. Could everybody hear that sound? Just to check on that. Did everybody hear the call? Okay. So chickadees are... Huh. So a lot of you couldn't hear the call, but Pete was able to. Huh. Okay, let me try that again to see if that... Oops. Okay, well, I'll continue on. So chickadees are a very common bird, and we see them in the wintertime especially. They stand out because they're one of the few birds that's very active. They're oftentimes in our feeder. And chickadees will feed on insects and berries and seeds. They'll also hide food under bark or dead leaves or in knot holes. And a really interesting thing about chickadees is that they're able to remember thousands of hiding places for up to 1 month. They oftentimes flock with other birds, and I have some pictures of those species that they can commonly be seen with here. Here on the left is a brown creeper. Here in the center is a ruby-crowned kinglet. Below that, this is a golden-crowned kinglet, white-breasted nuthatch, and a tufted titmouse, which is commonly seen flocking with chickadees. So these are some of the other birds you may see in flocks with chickadees, either near your feeder or out in the forest. Chickadees can excavate cavities on their own in dead trees when the wood is very soft by kind of pecking away at the rotted wood and carrying it away. But they'll also use old woodpecker holes if available. They don't have very strong, powerful beaks, so if the wood isn't very rotted, they have a difficult time excavating a cavity of their own. Sometimes they'll use nest boxes if natural cavities are not available. And as you can see, the chickadee up on the right, in the right-hand corner, has some moss in its uh, beak there, and they line the cavity of the tree with moss, feathers, plant down, hair, and insect cocoons. So I think a really interesting thing about chickadees is how they survive the winter. They're so small, and you see them out there. One way that they do it is by feeding on high-calorie foods like birdseed, but in areas where birdseed isn't available, I wonder oftentimes, looking at them, how they make it through the winter. One way is that they roost in those same cavities that they might nest in the winter time, and that provides some shelter from the cold. But they also have the ability to go into what's called regulated hypothermia. That's when they, on cold winter nights, actually can drop their body temperature from 18 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit below their normal body temperature in order to conserve energy. Okay, the next species is a common snapping turtle. And snapping turtles aren't necessarily a woodland species, though you can see them in woodlands and in a variety of different habitats, particularly if your woodlands are near a wetland or pond area where they may be spending most of their time. Snapping turtles can be large. They can be over 14 inches in length, excluding the tail, and they can weigh up to 45 pounds, so they can get quite large. They're omnivorous. They most frequently feed on aquatic plants and non-game fish. You can see the snapping turtle in this image is feeding on a fish. But they also eat insects, small mammals, young waterfowl, amphibians, and other reptiles. And they forage during the warmer months, but like most reptiles, they fast during the winter. So they're not eating during the winter months. The time of the year when we often see snapping turtles, when we're most likely to encounter them, is from May through June, when they leave the water to go find a nesting area. And this is similar with other turtle species too, like the painted turtle and oftentimes wood turtles. We can see them moving during the nesting season. So the females move from water, where they spend most of the year, to openings with well-drained sandy or loamy soils where they can kind of dig and lay their eggs. Some of the preferred areas are places like road embankments, where it's warm and the soil is easy to excavate. Also places like forest openings or clearings, and sometimes agricultural fields. I have a friend who regularly has snapping turtles moving from their pond and trying to lay eggs in the gravel at the edge of their driveway. A single nest can contain from 20 to 40 eggs, so they do lay quite a few eggs. The interesting thing about snapping turtles, as well as most turtles, is that they have something called temperature-dependent sex determination. And what that basically means is that the temperature of the egg during a certain developmental phase determines what sex that egg will become. So the temperature of the nest really affects the sex ratio. And for snapping turtles, only females are produced under warmer and cooler conditions. So from 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, males are produced, but in nests colder than 75 degrees or warmer than 85 degrees, females are produced. And this isn't the case with all turtles. For some, females are produced only at the warmer temperatures, and for others, females may only be produced at the cooler temperatures. But for snapping turtles, they have this kind of split conditions under which females will be produced. So, and similar temperature-dependent sex determination occurs in other reptiles too, like alligators and lizards in some cases. Walt Harris asked, what good do snapping turtles do? We'd rather move them away from our pond and save it for fish. Well, I guess that's a personal preference. Um, Snapping turtles really are kind of a top predator in the aquatic world, and you know they primarily feed on non-game fish, but you know it's really a I guess a personal preference. Snapping turtles are widespread and common for the most part, but there are concerns over declines in some areas, some localized areas. And in New York State, the snapping turtle is actually a species of greatest conservation need, in large part because of the declines that they're starting to see in some areas. Some of the predators of snapping turtles include predators primarily of the eggs and sometimes the young, things like raccoons, crows, and dogs, and you know, basically the predators that are frequently associated with high human populations. Loss of wetland and nesting habitat has also been implicated in some of the declines in snapping turtle populations, and overharvesting for meat. And in addition to that, snapping turtles may accumulate high concentrations of contaminants because they're kind of feeding at the top of the food chain. Contaminants, you know, that are in the fish and the plants and other organisms that they eat become concentrated in their bodies. Things like PCB and mercury becomes concentrated in their tissues. And interestingly, snapping turtles are often used in contaminant studies to serve as an indication of the level of contaminants in aquatic environments. So while that's one thing that turtles, snapping turtles are good for, they're kind of a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, and a way to be able to measure the pollutants in our environment in a kind of a direct way. For that reason, I personally wouldn't be interested in eating snapping turtle. I don't know if anybody else has eaten them and enjoys them. I know of people who have, but for an animal that you know accumulates that much that many contaminants in polluted environments, I think I personally would avoid it. But some people like them and really enjoy them. Okay, another thing, snapping turtles bite. And if anybody's had any experience with snapping turtles, you know this. You put a stick out in front of their mouths and they'll leap for it. They have kind of long snake-like necks. The reason that they bite, unlike a lot of other turtles, if you look at the plastron, the shell on the lower part of a turtle's body, unlike other turtles, it's very small and the flesh is exposed, the legs and the underbelly, so they're very vulnerable. A lot of other turtles have a larger plastron and are able to draw their entire bodies, including their legs, in under their shell and have a lot of protection. So snapping turtles are particularly vulnerable, and so that's, I think, how they develop this aggression. It's a way of protecting themselves. If you'd like to enhance habitat for snapping turtles, some things you can focus on are maintaining native vegetation in and throughout shallow wetlands and around the margins of large, deep ponds. This will really be helpful to other species of turtles and other amphibians and reptiles broadly as well. Having a lot of vegetation along a pond edge or a wetland edge provides foraging habitat, you know, attracts food there, and also some hiding and escape cover. You can also provide a buffer zone of natural vegetation of 100 feet or more surrounding ponds and wetlands. So, you know, turtles, these aquatic turtles, like the painted turtle and the snapping turtle, they spend a large portion of their life cycle in the water, but the land is important um, for that very, very important phase of their lives, which is, you know, the laying of eggs and hatching of young. So both aquatic and terrestrial environments are really important for these animals. You can maintain open areas with loose soil near aquatic habitats for nesting sites, things like old log landings. At the Arnott Forest, Cornell's Teaching and Research Forest, we have one large wetland area, and just across the road from that, a small dirt road, is a log landing that's used every year by painted turtles. They cross over and they regularly lay their eggs in that opening. Okay, the next species I wanted to talk about is the ruffed grouse, which is a popular favorite among a lot of people. The ruffed grouse, one of the reasons I think it's interesting is that it's really a true northern bird. So it's very, very adapted to cold climates. And some of the ways that grouse deal with cold weather is that they may roost in coveys or groups of birds. And another way that grouse protect themselves is by roosting in evergreen trees in the wintertime. As you know, when you walk into, say, a cluster of hemlocks in the wintertime, it's more protected from wind, has a slightly warmer microclimate under conifers. In the summertime, you go into a group of conifers, and it's a slightly cooler climate. So evergreens really have a unique microclimate, and so grouse take advantage of that to conserve energy in the wintertime. Another thing that grouse, another adaptation that grouse have for winter is that you can see here in the bottom right, they bury themselves in the snow. And by burrowing under the snow, they're actually insulated from freezing conditions. If you think about it, it provides a nice blanket of warmth under which they can kind of stay and conserve energy. So the one drawback of that is if you have an icing situation where you have snow and it turns to ice, then at times grouse can get trapped under the snow. But for the most part, a lot of snow in the winter is a beneficial condition for grouse for winter survival. In the center here, you'll see a picture of the foot of a grouse, and you notice these fringe-like feathers along the edge here. And those feathers enable grouse to kind of act as snowshoes and enable grouse to walk on the surface of the snow. So they really are truly adapted to cold winter conditions. I just wanted to show this slide of the change in days with snow on the ground over the last 30 years. And this is specific to the Northeast. But you can see that the large red circles are days which have had 30 or fewer days of snow cover each year annually over the last 30 years. And I think that's an average. And so you can see in a lot of areas in New York State, there has been quite a decrease in the number of days with snow. And this would be a disadvantage for a species like grouse. Okay, grouse, one of the things that, another interesting thing about grouse, that's something that folks may be familiar with, is the characteristic sound that's made by grouse during the breeding season. It's a familiar bass-like drumming sound that males make, and you often hear this in late March to early May, and occasionally also, once again, in the fall, not because it's breeding season, but just that they tend to drum occasionally during the period in the fall when the temperatures and length of daylight are similar to that in the spring during the breeding season. So now I've attempted to, I have this video to show you, hopefully this will work, of a grouse drumming. See if this works. So is everybody able to see that? All right, nice. So I think it's amazing that drumming, the bass-like drumming sound that echoes throughout the woods can be made just using air and feathers. Okay, so now we'll move on to grouse food and what they eat. In the springtime, grouse feed a lot on the buds and catkins of aspen, birch, and hop hornbeam. And the picture in the upper left is a picture of aspen buds. Aspen is a very, very important food for grouse year-round. In the summer, then, Grouse will feed on leaves, again, of aspen or other trees, fruits, seeds of aspen, cherry, sedges, strawberry, blackberry, and raspberry. And in the fall, they're eating fruits of hawthorn and apple and cherry, viburnum, sumac, and dogwood, and then beech nuts and buds of some of the more common understory tree species. In the winter, um, grouse will feed on cherry, aspen, birch, hop hornbeam, and serviceberry buds. In the picture in the lower left there is a picture of a grouse feeding on mountain ash berries. A few people weren't able to see the video, and for those of you who weren't able to, if you go to YouTube and search for ruffed grouse drumming, there are a number of really nice videos of grouse drumming that you can view. Okay, so if you want to manage habitat for grouse, grouse are considered an early successional species. That means that they prefer or require young forest conditions to do best. But grouse really, in addition to that, those young forests, they really need a kind of a mosaic of different age classes to succeed. So one thing you can do is to create and maintain patches of young forest that are in close proximity to 10 to 25-year-old pole stands for wintering and breeding cover, and then mature 25 to 40-year-old mature aspen for winter food resources. You can maintain patches of conifers, again, to provide that winter cover. You can leave large logs on the forest floor. You can see how important large logs are for drumming sites and also for escape cover. And then also leave tops of trees for escape cover on the forest floor. In the understory, it's always good to encourage those species that provide food, things like grapevines, blackberries, hop hornbeam, serviceberry, etc. And in the overstory, you can encourage aspen growth for winter food, and they also will feed on beech and black cherry during the winter. And the next species that I chose was the eastern newt, and I chose the eastern newt because I think it's just a really, really cool animal. Some of you might be familiar with the eastern newt as we're seeing it here on the left. I can get my pointer to work here. This is the aquatic phase of the eastern newt, and this is when you normally will see them looking like this in your ponds. These are in a beaker just for the sake of taking a good picture of an aquatic animal. And then you also may be familiar with this stage of the eastern newt, the same animal that you might see walking across the forest floor during the summer months or after a rain, maybe crossing a woodland road or a skid trail. And so if you've seen either or both of these animals, you should know that they are the same, indeed the same species. The eastern newt has an incredibly interesting life cycle. They begin, so as adults here, they are entirely aquatic. They have kind of a fishy feeling skin, a long keeled tail that helps them for swimming. They're kind of an olive color, and they have these spots on these red spots on their back. As adults, they lay 200 to 400 eggs each year, each spring, and they attach each egg individually to a plant. Then those eggs will hatch into aquatic larvae, and you see there are these kind of start out as a little bit like tadpole-like looking creatures, but they have external gills that form really bushy gills that are on the outside. So unlike fish who have internal gills that you don't see, these gills are external, and they have a tail and four legs, unlike a tadpole that you would see early in development. So as the aquatic larvae mature, they start to lose their aquatic gills. Their skin turns into a different texture, a drier textured skin. They lose the keels on their tails, and they emerge from the water as what's called the eft phase of the eastern newt. And the eft phase is really a terrestrial phase. They may stay on land for 2 to 7 years before they go back, transform once again into the aquatic phase, and go back to the water as once they are mature, sexually mature adults, so they can breed and lay eggs. Rich asks, are newts the ones that make up a huge percent of the woodland biomass? And actually, yes and no. The species of salamander that's touted as making up being the most abundant terrestrial vertebrate in the Northeast is actually the redback salamander. But but the density of newts, both if you took the density of newts, both aquatic and terrestrial, I bet they would be fairly similar in localized areas where you have those aquatic habitats, because they can reach very high densities, particularly in pond and wetland environments. So there are quite a few of them. I would say they are definitely important. The aquatic adult, Terry asks, how long does the aquatic adult live? Um, I'm not quite sure, but I think, for a lot of salamanders, they can live 12 to 15 years, somewhere around that age. So you can imagine that they have to be fairly long-lived if they're going to spend their non-breeding years, up to 7 years, as non-breeding adults. There has to be some time then for them to reproduce and contribute to the population. So another really neat thing about these animals is that this is the typical life stage of an eastern newt. Aquatic adult, lays eggs, aquatic larvae, then terrestrial eft for 2 to 7 years, and then becomes an adult. But in some populations, and we've noticed this at the Arnott Forest, that sometimes there are adults that will come back out of the water in the fall, almost on an annual basis, kind of transform into something that looks like the eft phase, maybe not quite as brightly colored as it was as a juvenile, moves across land, maybe to a spring seep or an area like that, and overwinters there, and then will emerge and come back to the pond in the spring. And I think that may be in response to kind of environmental stress conditions, or maybe if the population is too dense in a given pond. But we've noticed that that these animals can actually go back and forth between stages in some areas. And we've also read that on Long Island, for example, there actually is no terrestrial phase of the eastern newt. That on Long Island, newts are aquatic for their entire life. So it's really neat how flexible these animals are in terms of the life stages that they progress through. Carla Porter asks, can you find signs of newts or salamanders if you don't see them in person? Carla, I think that in a pond environment, it's pretty easy to see them if you're looking for them. When salamanders or newts are on land, just like with a lot of woodland amphibians and reptiles, if you're not looking for them, you're not likely to see them, with the exception of the eft, which sometimes just kind of jumps out. It's so brightly colored that you really can't miss it. But other times, the best way to find these animals is to look under rocks and logs and pieces of bark, and actually actively search for them. Of course, being careful to replace those rocks and logs back exactly where they were, so that you maintain that nice moist environment under those cover objects, because animals will go back and use the same cover objects over and over and over again. Terry asks how far they travel away from the water source, and newts will travel probably 1 to 2 kilometers from their water source. So that's a half mile to a mile. And so, if you find the F's somewhere in the forest, that's a good indicator that there's some pond or permanent source of water not too far away. Okay, so I just wanted to show, this is just another instance, especially, concerning amphibians and reptiles, where these animals really depend on both aquatic environments and a healthy surrounding forest or terrestrial environment. Newts feed on a variety of organisms, mostly things like mosquito larvae and aquatic insects, leeches and freshwater clams and snails, and the eggs and larvae of other amphibians. And this picture actually is part of a video that I took again at a pond at the Arnott Forest. This newt is feeding on, you can see it up here, here's the newt, and it's feeding on wood frog eggs. So just having a nice buffet there, tearing through the protective shell and feeding on these wood frog eggs. Here's a picture of the eft, a kind of a smaller eft. They have also their bright colors are aposematic coloration. That's considered bright colors that warn potential enemies of its toxicity. And these animals are, in fact, poisonous, not poisonous to touch, but poisonous to eat. So you don't have to be worried about it unless you don't want to use them as a survival food, certainly. Um, the aquatic form is not as toxic as the terrestrial form, but they do have some toxins. The toxin that their glands produce is something called tetrodotoxin, and that's a neurotoxin and a strong emetic. An emetic is something that induces vomiting. It's a chemical similar to that in poison dart frogs. One interesting paper that I read said that during a research project, they studied the toxicity of newts, and there were Fs that were retained by toads or snakes for up to 30 minutes, and then the toads or snakes would regurgitate them, and the Fs would actually recover without lasting ill effects. And I thought that was both interesting and disturbing. Can you imagine being eaten by an animal and then being regurgitated back up? That would have some lasting psychological damage if you were a human, I would think. But for newts, apparently they went on without concern. The next animal that I wanted to talk about, or actually animals, there are two different species in New York State of flying squirrels. We have both the northern and southern flying squirrels in New York State, and the northern flying squirrels being more common toward the northern half of the state, and the southern flying squirrels more common in the southern part of the state. Pennsylvania has both species as well. And flying squirrels are the smallest species of squirrels in New York State. They weigh only a few ounces. They get up to about 10 inches long for the southern flying squirrel, and about 10 to 15 inches long for the northern flying squirrel, which is slightly larger. These animals are nocturnal, and thus their big eyes, and they're very common, very common. In fact, although we seldom see them, occasionally they can be seen at bird feeders. If you have a feeder and you're in a forested environment, and you may see them feeding at night. I've put a turkey carcass out on a table on a deck in a wooded situation after Thanksgiving, and seen flying squirrels come in and feed on the turkey carcass. Another way that you might be able to see flying squirrels, they oftentimes use woodpecker nests, abandoned holes created by woodpeckers. And during the daylight, I read that if you kind of tap or knock on the tree next to the woodpecker nest, if there is a flying squirrel, oftentimes they'll kind of peek out of the hole to see what's going on. So that may be one way to see if you have them in your forest. Walt Harris asks, is there a humane way to get a flying squirrel nest out of an attic? And that's yes, there is, Walt. There are a number of things that you can do, and I'd be happy to hang on after the presentation and talk about that, because it's kind of a detailed process, but I'd be happy to discuss that. Okay, so flying squirrels don't actually have wings, but they have flaps of skin that extend from their wrists to their ankles and act as kind of miniature parachutes. When they leave a tree, they initially drop straight down for about 3 feet or so and kind of catch the big air before flattening out into a glide. And they use their tails and also changing the position of their legs to move those membranes and kind of guide them to swerve around obstacles. So the higher they are when they leave the tree, the faster and farther they can go. And from heights of 100 feet, they can reach speeds of up to 20 miles per hour and glide as far as 50 yards. So it's over half the length of a football field. The interesting thing is that these animals really require large areas of very mature, deciduous or mixed forest with large trees and cavities in them for nesting and escape cover. You can imagine if you have to go from tree to ground or tree to tree, that you'd need a large area in which to operate. Flying squirrels usually, again, occupy old woodpecker holes in the winter, but in the warmer months they'll often build leaf nests in the crotch of trees, so similar to other squirrels. It's good for forest stands to be open beneath the tree canopy to provide unobstructed gliding areas for movement and from tree to tree and from tree to ground. So Again, these animals are oftentimes, that's why they're found in mature forests where there's less likely to be interfering vegetation in the subcanopy. And you can have, they've found up to 50 animals in one nest. They're very gregarious, and especially in the wintertime, large numbers of squirrels can congregate together. And while this is one reason, I've had an experience with this with 21 squirrels, flying squirrels, in our house in the wintertime. So yes, indeed, if you think you have a few, you may have more than a few in your attic. So they definitely do congregate in large groups. So in terms of what flying squirrels eat, northern flying squirrels in particular feed heavily on truffles, which are the fruiting bodies of mycorrhizal fungi that live in association with tree roots. So mycorrhizal fungi, if you're not familiar with it, increases the ability of trees to absorb nutrients and water from the forest soil. And by feeding on the fungi and then depositing the spores in the soil through their droppings, the flying squirrels spread the spores throughout the forest and therefore are really significant in terms of tree and forest health. Some other foods that flying squirrels eat are, for the northern flying squirrel, they also eat seeds and buds, fruit, insects, and small animals. And for the southern flying squirrel, they eat seeds, hickory nuts, acorns. They really like the mast, berries, bark, flowers, insects, and other animal matter. And they really, when it says other animal matter, they definitely will eat, any kind of dead animal material as well. A couple winters, I put trail cameras out on gut piles during deer season, just as a way of finding out what was feeding on the leftovers left in the forest. And I, on more than one occasion, had pictures of flying squirrels at night coming down and feeding on the gut piles. So they're really not too particular in terms of what they'll eat, particularly in the winter. They're really omnivorous, but very cute and very interesting nonetheless. So to enhance habitat for flying squirrels, there are a few things that you can do. Again, you can retain live and dead trees that contain holes in them. Ideally, they really prefer old woodpecker holes that are about 8 to 20 feet from the ground and have an entrance hole of about 1.5 to 2 inches in diameter. Large beech trees often provide cavities for nesting wildlife and also produce the seeds that serve as food. Beech trees often form cavities where the branches break off. And also retaining woody debris and rotten logs on the forest floor provides additional sites for flying squirrels to take refuge from predators when they're foraging, and also promotes the growth of fungi, which they in turn use for food. Oh, and Katie asked, will they use nest boxes? And yes, there's a lot of information on the web about nest boxes for flying squirrels. Okay, the next species is the bobcat. The bobcat is not necessarily common in all places, but is fairly widespread and is becoming more common in some areas. The bobcat is elusive and solitary, and even when they are found in an area, they can be difficult to spot. They're mainly nocturnal, but sometimes they'll venture out in the daytime. And during the winter, you might know that a bobcat is in the area because you'll be able to spot its tracks in the snow. And there's the picture down on the right there is a picture of bobcat tracks. It kind of gives you a sense for the distance that the tracks are apart and also the size of the tracks. You can see the pointer there. Bobcats are opportunistic predators. Again, they'll eat small animals such as mice, and voles, and shrews. Squirrels, as you can see in this picture, you see that bobcat has a gray squirrel in its mouth, and chipmunks, um, birds, rabbits, and other hares really form the bulk of the bobcat's diet. They'll also feed on porcupines, which seems like a risky proposition. They'll feed on minks, muskrats, skunks, and then fish, frogs, and insects as well. So really they're fairly omnivorous, but feeding mostly on or they're fairly opportunistic, but they are definitely predators and feed mostly on meat. The bobcats inhabit extensive forest areas. They really need large areas of habitat to find them food. Wooded swamps, they use rocky outcrops, and occasionally agricultural areas as well, or places where there's a mixture of these habitats. They need rocky ledges and rock piles for shelter, breeding, and raising young. It's not necessarily a requirement, but it's definitely a plus for bobcats. They'll also use brush piles and hollow trees and logs as cover for resting and for dens. Somebody asked here, Brian asked, will they feed on carrion? And I would assume so. So here is a picture up here in the upper left of a potential bobcat den right here under this rocky area. And then again, here you have this bobcat. I thought that was just the cutest picture. This bobcat using this hole in the top of a broken off tree. Okay, the next species is the wood frog. And the wood frog is an interesting frog. It's the earliest breeding frog that we have in the Northeast. It begins calling and breeding in as early as March or early April. And let's see, I'm going to try for, I don't think I have the wood frog call actually. But the wood frog will be found in and around small pools in wooded areas. So oftentimes what you hear is seasonal woodland pools or vernal pools, areas that hold water during the spring and oftentimes during the fall, but dry up later in the summer. So they lay their eggs in these pools. They hatch rather rapidly, and they have to grow and develop within just a couple of months and emerge from the water during that same season, and as little tiny froglets. During the rest of the year, they are foraging out in the woods and can be found under logs and under leaf litter during the summer. So really, these animals use, they're kind of the opposite as the aquatic turtles. They actually use the water for just for breeding and rearing the growth of their young. And then they're out in the forest. They're really forest animals for the rest of the year. Oh, Pete's posted a wood frog video and sound. Link to that. Thank you, Pete. Thanks very much. Here's a picture of a woodland pool that might be used by wood frogs up in the upper left. Right here, this is a really good potential habitat for wood frogs, as well as some other amphibians, things like spotted salamanders and Jefferson salamanders that also use this type of habitat in a similar way. Here's a cluster of eggs. You may see these eggs in the springtime. If you look, they're actually quite common in habitats like this. And then a picture here on the right of a forest that may be used for the rest of the year by these animals. So again, another really interesting thing, and it has to do with how animals in northern climates like ours deal with the winter. But wood frogs have this really neat adaptation. They can actually withstand sub-freezing temperatures down as low as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. And they don't, unlike other amphibians or reptiles, they aren't underwater, buried in the mud where it prevents them from freezing in the winter. They're actually out in the forest under the leaf litter. And so those freezing temperatures do reach them. What happens with wood frogs is that there's a protein in their blood that causes the blood to freeze first and draw water out of their cells. And when that happens, then high levels of glucose actually fill into the cells and keep them from freezing and bursting. So in that way, the wood frog actually, it's directing the fluids are directed out of the cells and into other areas of the body and prevents their cells from being destroyed. I read that you can actually, if you drop a wood frog, they actually are frozen pretty solid, and they can freeze and thaw multiple times throughout the winter. If you drop them, it actually makes a clinking sound. They are indeed frozen. So I thought that was a really neat adaptation to winter. To enhance habitat for wood frogs, you can protect aquatic breeding sites and the surrounding woods. You can protect breeding sites from pollution, so protect woodland pools from chemicals and sediments from erosion filling into those habitats. In surrounding woodlands, it's helpful to maintain a mostly closed forest canopy within a 100-foot buffer adjacent to the aquatic sites where they're breeding. So about 75% canopy cover within that first 100 feet. And then you can have a little bit more open canopy within the next 300 feet after that, maybe trying to maintain about 50% canopy closure. And this serves two purposes. The first is that it maintains shade around the pool so that you don't have it drying out prematurely during the late spring, and also provides some good hiding, cover, and foraging areas within the adjacent woodlands. You can also leave coarse woody debris or woody material, logs and treetops on the forest floor, again, that benefits so many different species. And locate skid trails during timber harvests about 400 feet away from breeding pools. And harvesting timber when the ground is either frozen or completely dry, if that's a possibility, can also be very helpful in terms of maintaining good habitat for these animals. Okay, now on to our next animal. We have the Barbed Owl. And I am going to try a Barbed Owl call. Playing it now. Could you all hear that call? I'll play it again just in case. All right, great. Everybody's hearing that one. So that call is described as "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" The Barbed Owl is the most vocal of our owls. They call year-round, and courtship begins in February, and that's when they're the most vocal. So coming right up on us here. They have territories of 200 to 400 acres in size, and so they really need large, extensive forest areas. They nest in cavities or in abandoned hawk, squirrel, or crow's nests. The Barbed Owl is an opportunistic predator. They eat small mammals and rabbits. You can see in this picture the Barbed Owl is coming down and catching a mouse in its talons, a mouse that's on a downed log. So again, emphasizing the value of woody material on the forest floor. They also feed on amphibians and reptiles and invertebrates, including crayfish. And Carol mentions here about an owl that fishes in her pond. Owls absorb the nutritious part of their prey, and then they regurgitate the indigestible matter, so hair, feathers, bones, claws, and insect chitin as round pellets, and that happens about 7 hours after a meal. So if you look, particularly if you're adjacent to a stream where there's a grove of hemlocks and you look at the base of the hemlock trees, I've often found owl pellets at the base of some of these trees, and can make for a really fun winter activity to bring those in and dissect them and see what you might find. The Barbed Owl prefers, again, large, unfragmented blocks of forest. They mate for life. They'll reuse their nest site for many years and, again, maintain territories that are quite large in size. They're most often associated with mature and old-growth forests of mixed hardwood and conifers because of a greater availability of potential nest sites there. So the mixed deciduous and coniferous forest is really preferred by them. And they also can be found near water oftentimes, or right in riparian areas adjacent to water. And in part, that's because that's a good place to find food. You can encourage Barbed Owls by maintaining mature forest stands with 2 or more trees per acre that are 20 inches in diameter or larger, so very large trees, to allow for development of cavities or dead trees that are snags suitable for nesting sites. And you can also maintain mature trees and buffers along streams and rivers in those areas, again, where barred owls are most likely to find an abundant food source. All right, and our last species, and I'll zip right through this one, is the ring-necked snake. And I think the ring-necked snake I chose, nothing particularly interesting about the ring-necked snake, although they are very beautiful animals. They're small, slender woodland snakes, small to medium sized. It grows to an average of about 15 inches, so really quite small. These animals, though, similar to a lot of our woodland snakes, the red-bellied snake, the northern or Decay's brown snake, the smooth green snake, they're seldom seen unless you're actually looking for them actively. So lifting up rocks, especially shale, maybe at a road cut in near a forested area, they're seldom seen unless you're actually actively searching for them. So I encourage you to do so, again, putting the rocks back where you found them so that it maintains that nice microhabitat for them. But it's really very interesting. They're very small and very docile, very harmless. These animals feed on a wide variety of items, especially things like slugs and worms, the occasional small salamander, a very small snake because they're small themselves, and small frogs. Here's some pictures of some ringneck snakes. You can see just by the pictures, the photo on the bottom left, that they really are actually quite small. And this is about a medium-sized ringneck snake. The young, when you find them in the spring, after they've hatched, are very, very small. In fact, the smaller of them, when they've just hatched, are really smaller than a worm. They're tiny. And again, really nice looking animals. They have that yellowish, orangish belly and that similarly colored peach or orangish ring around their necks. Again, they're secretive. You really don't see them often unless you're looking. And they're very docile. I don't think I've ever seen one of these guys try to bite, though they often exude that pungent, unpleasant smelling musky substance similar to garter snakes, though in lesser quantities, so it's not as bad. So if you go out looking for these snakes, take a friend, have them hold them first, and then pass them on to you when that's over. So if you wanted to enhance habitat for these woodland snakes, they really like moist, shady woodlands. Specific sites that they use can be varied and include mature or second growth forests, old fields, rocky hillsides, grassy fields, and the borders of streams and rivers. Forest edges and roadside cuts are a great place to find them, and forest openings like log landings and skid trails might provide a nice, attractive, sunny site to bask. We at the Arnott Forest, we've experimented with taking piles of butt logs at a log landing, and instead of having them buried, actually leaving them at the edge of the log landing. And we've had great success in attracting these small woodland snakes to these areas. They're really great for enhancing habitat. Another feature, an area where we found quite a few of these animals, is at a wildlife management area nearby, where there's this trail where there's been some erosion. There's a lot of shale in the area. This goes right up along within a forested area, and it seems like they really use this area to come out and bask in the spring, right when they come up from hibernation. They kind of sun themselves and then probably move out into the forest where they spend the rest of the summer. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to try to answer a couple of questions if we have time.
Hi, Kristi. Thanks. We do have plenty of time. Let me rearrange things here a little bit while people are thinking about their questions.
Okay, Marcia has a question. How often do black bears have cubs? Black bears will have cubs in January while they're in hibernation, and then they won't have cubs again until 2 years later in January. So they skip a year. Every other year they have cubs. So the cubs will stay with them through that entire first year and until the summer of the second year, when it's the breeding season. And at that point, the cubs are chased away. And Caitlin asks, what's the difference between torpor and hibernation? And I'll just say that hibernation is during hibernation, the true hibernation, the body temperature will be reduced, and they don't wake up during the winter. Bears don't really have that because their body temperature stays relatively high, and they can wake up periodically during the winter if they disturb. Yes, I hear that echo too. It's since Pete turned on his audio. There you go. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Are there any other questions? Things that I might have missed earlier on? Oh yeah, somebody asked about the flying squirrels in the attic. Thank you very much. Um, okay, so there are a couple of different ways. If you can identify where the flying squirrels are coming in and out, and they really can come in and out of fairly small holes. Not, of course, something as small as a mouse, but at the end of where the soffit and fascia meet, sometimes they'll be coming in there. Thank you, everybody who's leaving. Thank you very much for your participation. So one way that I've dealt with flying squirrels, if you can find a hole that they're leaving from, you can actually create a tube using hardware cloth, mount that with one end at the hole and the other end kind of extending out away from the house, so that when they exit the hole, so you actually put a little, when they exit the hole, they come down through, and then they're out of the house, and when they go back to that hole to get in, they can't figure out how to get back in at that immediate site. So make the tube about, oh, I don't know, maybe 18 inches long or so. And with flying squirrels, you may want to actually put a flap on the end of that tube, one that opens just one direction, so a one-way door that will open, and they can push out of it, but then it'll fall back down, and they can't get back into it, just in case they figure it out. The other way is to actually live trap them and move them to a different area. That takes a little extra effort, and you have to take them, there are different rules guiding removal in different states, so you should definitely check into that. But that's another option. Of course, that's not something you want to do. You'll need to figure out a way to prevent them from coming back in the house, and trap them out fairly quickly, so that they aren't harmed and aren't stuck in your house for a long period of time. But that's another way that you can remove them, and they're fairly easy to trap with a small live trap and some peanuts or seeds, and they're fairly. We had some success with that. We made sure we closed up all the other holes that the squirrels were getting out of, and the squirrels actually had started coming in under the flashing next to the chimney, and there was really not much we could do, to put a one-way door on that, because they could just come back up, crawl up the roof and get back in. But so those are just two methods that you can use. The one-way door is really helpful if you're able to do it. Thank you all very much. Let's see, I see a question from Susan about how fast does the red F change to the aquatic adult. If you mean in terms of days, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. It's a hormonal change. Hormones really induce the change in the animal, and I don't know, I would say, over a few days anyway. You can start to see them. Sometimes you see them when they're kind of halfway in between. Their color is changing, but I'm not sure exactly.
Okay, we'll have some echo perhaps, but my thanks to Kristi. This was a great presentation. Looks like everybody enjoyed it. If there's more questions for next minute or two, I suspect Kristi can stick around. There was, Kristi, if you scroll back to 13:05 on the timestamp, Renee had a question.
Okay. All right, let's look for Renee's question. Renee asked about a wet area on a pathway that you occasionally take a vehicle through. The best way to make that wet spot passable without harming habitat. That's a really good question. Coarse rocks, maybe, but a lot of animals will actually burrow down under those coarse rocks and find, some cover under there. So that may not be really the best idea. I don't know if there's some way possible to put I don't know, maybe to go around it, or if it dries out, to just go through it when it's dry, or build kind of a little overpass, a little wooden boardwalk type of a thing with, or at least something that was drivable, that was slightly elevated above the water. But that, depending on how much time and effort that would take, I don't know, how worthwhile that would be for you, but that might be one possibility.
Okay, well, Kristi, thank you very much. This was a great presentation, and I'd like to thank all of our participants as well, and hope you all have a great afternoon. Join us on the third Wednesday of February. Paul Catanzaro from University of Massachusetts will be giving a presentation on your land and your legacy. So thank you all and enjoy the day.
Yes, thank you all very much for joining us.